Most of what goes on in sport goes on off the playing field.
It's about what you have on them in order to protect yourself.
I was first raped violently.
Well, you're finished. You'll never play football again.
Obviously, shoe contracts worth $400,000 or $500,000.
Morals and ethics don't exist above and beyond the society that they're a part of.
Nowadays, kids are faced with the choice of do you want a couple $1 million or your college degree?
Sport is a metaphor for what goes on in the real world.
Welcome to the Virtual Summit, an ongoing international conference on academics and sports, where sports ethics issues such as sports violence, cheating, racism, and sexism are considered within their philosophical and historical context. Ethics and management issues in sport take on a different appearance when viewed within a larger historical and philosophical context. When we identify some of the big picture philosophical questions raised by sports, and when we review some key moments in the cultural history of American sports, it becomes clear that many of the problems that we face today emerge from fundamental questions of long standing and from decisions made by sports managers long ago. By placing sports in this larger cultural context, we realize that our pressing ethical and management issues in sports emerge from choices and conditions which began years ago and continue in society right up to today. How good were the good old days in sport? Not as good as we might like to believe.
In the 1920s, it was a very corrupt decade in college sports, and it culminated with the Carnegie Foundation doing a report on college football primarily, but other college sports, and just the incredible corruption that was going on, phony courses, non-registered athletes, all of this. And the Carnegie Foundation pointed to really the central problem, that you have institutions of higher education that are trying to take the brightest students in the high school population and train them in this very complex educational system at the highest level. You also have kids with phenomenal athletic ability who have spent a majority of their childhood and adolescence perfecting their athletic ability, but have not necessarily done much about their academic ability. And how do they necessarily belong in institutions of higher education?
Today's highly racialized sport has a history. Now, the period I'm dealing with from the 20s through the 50s, race is not a major part of football, but for some very important reasons. The South was absolutely segregated. I am old enough to have played in the Cotton Bowl as a senior at Notre Dame on January 1st, 1970 against the University of Texas before Texas had an integrated football team. Their first black football player was the following fall. And Texas was not the last. The last Southeast Conference team to integrate, I believe, was in 1973. So we're talking about something, within our own adult memories, not something in the distant past. In the period of the 20s to 30s, and even continuing in the 40s and 50s, but say in the 20s and 30s, there was literally one or two black players on some northern teams. When UCLA in 1939 had four, Jackie Robinson, Kenny Washington, Woody Strode, and then a fourth who was not a great star and a big star. This was unprecedented. I mean, this was remarkable. One of the parts of the book I'm working on now is looking at football in this Jim Crow era, and seeing what happened and how these black athletes were treated, and the sort of the focus of that is a whole series of incidents in which a northern team with a black player or maybe two was scheduled to play a Southern team in an intersectional game. And intersectional games were really important in this era because football was locally rooted, and local pride in the football team was really important. And intersectional games provided an opportunity for, say, Georgia Tech in Atlanta to prove that it was as good as or better than, the supposed elite teams in the Northeast and the Big Ten and so on. So intersectional games were prominent in this era. But when the intersectional game involved a Southern team and a Northern team with a black player or two, the common agreement that the Northern team made, the athletic director and the coach made, was that the black players will not play. They will not suit up.
About Bear Bryant's first college team at Maryland. He was coaching at Naval Pre-Flight in North Carolina, and was hired by Curly Bird, the president of Maryland, who had been a football coach, by the way. And but he didn't show up for the first game. It was the week before the first game, and Curly Bird called him up and said, "Hey, Bear, where's the team? We got a game on Saturday and against Davidson." And Bear said, "Don't worry." And what he did is he loaded his naval team onto a couple of buses. They drove up to College Park, Maryland. They had lunch. This was on Wednesday. He took them over to the registrar's office. Lo and behold, they were college students, although many had played pro ball, had played college ball previously. On Saturday, they went out and they beat Davidson 60-7. And this is the beginning of Bear Bryant's college career. So this was a period of tremendous corruption in college sports, and in basketball itself, it culminated, of course, in the famous scandals, the fix scandals of the late 1940s, early 50s, where national championship teams like Kentucky were fixing games.
About 20 years ago, some of you may remember that Kermit Washington fractured the coach of Houston's jaw and eye socket with one of the most vicious assaults in the context of a game that I can ever remember. There was Chicago Bears Dick Butkus who said, "I would never set out to hurt anyone deliberately unless it was, important, like in a league game." Or Calvin Murphy, the little guy who said, "My theory on fighting is don't fight fair, surprise them, get them when they're coming out of the church." Or was it only 40 years ago? I was showing my daughter a video of my father, who used to be the coach of the New York Knickerbockers, in a game that was played in 1956. And in the 2-minute clip that I saw, Carl Braun, who was one of his players, hauled off and hit Dolph Schayes in the face with a sucker punch. Dolph Schayes, for those of you who don't remember, has a son who's now a 19-year veteran in the NBA. That's how far back the fighting goes. And it's certainly not 40 years. Teddy Roosevelt stepped in because of violence in sport at the turn of the century.
The NCAA knew about all this. It didn't have enforcement powers yet, but for instance, in the basketball, the NCAA in the 1940s played the entire men's basketball tournament in Madison Square Garden, which was the center of the fixed games, and gamblers would sit at courtside, sort of yelling instructions to the players. And the NCAA would never leave Madison Square Garden simply because they made more money by playing in Madison Square Garden than anywhere else. Now, they eventually left, not because the scandals hadn't been broken. They left in 1950, not for any ethical reason, but they felt that the rent was too high at Madison Square Gardens. And if they went to regional, they went to Kansas City and various regional arenas because they got a much better deal for their tournament. So it seemed to me very early on, the NCAA was driven by money and a money imperative. And for all the claims of ethics, money has driven them. Mike Series in the Kansas City Star does a brilliant job of showing what a money machine the NCAA is.
And for me in the NBA, there's now this kind of generational divide, and there are the elder statesmen, if you will, Michael, of course, Scotty, Barkley, Carl, and Stockton, and these guys who are in their mid-30s, who seem to comprise one segment, and often they are asked to comment on this kind of, Gen X or hip-hop generation or whatever you want to call it, the younger guys. So, for instance, we hear stories about Kobe Bryant blowing Karl Malone off on a pick. I don't want your pick. And Karl being offended by that. Karl Malone, the greatest pick setter in the history of basketball. And here's this 19-year-old kid who's never gone to college saying he doesn't want a pick from Karl Malone. Well, how dare you? I think this kind of generational difference here also has a lot to say in terms of that question about style and also about race. Because to me, it's very coded in terms of class. And clearly, Michael and the older generation, the kind of, elder statesmen of the league now, embrace this kind of class-specific notion of who they are and how they should represent themselves, as opposed to the younger generation, again, being influenced by hip-hop, and very much embracing this kind of lower class form of identity. And I talk about this in my book. I call it the idea of the nigger. And the way in which they represent themselves as nigga, N-I-G-G-A, and the way in which this term is so, say, specific to hip-hop culture, but also to their identity, this identity of, as they would define it, not giving a in essence. And this kind of attitude, this very aggressive but also dismissive attitude, I think has caused a great deal of rift in the league. And it's an example that, we've heard as recently as a few weeks ago, the kind of throat-cutting gesture that, immediately they went around and they found Michael and Charles and everybody and asked them to dismiss the negativity of this gesture, which was being performed by, again, some of the younger players.
There was no black football players in the National Football League from 1933 through 1945. And although nobody's been able to document exactly why that was, it's pretty well understood that there was a kind of agreement among the owners. And maybe the principal one was George Preston Marshall, the owner of the Washington Redskins, who was a Southerner and was racist. The Redskins were the last team to integrate.
It's not about ball anymore. It's professional. It's orchestrated. It's systematic. I mean, cats play. They don't play for the love of the game anymore. They play now, as a way of life, make a living.
But what my work does is help us put what's going on today into a different perspective in this way. One is, this basic idea that we experience football in mediated forms, everybody would sort of say, oh, of course, we all watch on television today. But it's useful to know that that's been the case from the beginning, that organized sport as we know it, spectator sport as we know it, is mediated sport, is an important thing to realize, because it makes us realize that the media is not just, the sort of the vehicle, but it is in fact a determining agent in shaping the way that we understand these games. And that has been going on for a long time. And thinking about how television, conveys a sport like football differently from other media, it becomes a useful way of thinking about our present moment in a wider perspective.
Many people get really kind of upset and they want to go back to the past. I don't think we can go back to the past. I think that some of the kinds of norms that we felt comfortable with in the past, governing our behavior, our relationship with others, are not applicable. And we can get romantic about what things were. By the way, I don't want to go back to a past that was characterized by gender inequity, characterized by racism, pre-civil rights, the things that Kareem talked about. That's not the past that I want to see revived in any way in the future.
The facts of the matter are that many aspects of sport are much improved. What went on during the early history of American sport seems in part to be far worse than many things occurring today. As Dr. Sperber pointed out, the excesses and evils of unregulated collegiate sports brought about the formation of the NCAA. And the NCAA itself has a history that includes the toleration of many activities which now seems intolerable. Dr. Oriard and Dr. Boyd stressed that sports for most of us is a mediated activity. That is, sports is experienced by most of us through media relays or media reporting. As the media has grown in importance and influence, so has sports. From the 1880s on to today, Dr. Oriard finds that sports broadcasting and sports reporting symbiotically developed into today's powerful organizations and businesses. Drs. Lapchick and Coakley exemplified why it would be misleading to say that the ethical situation of sports today is worse than it has ever been in history. However, Bonnie Blair and Alan Page both illustrate why, in particular circumstances, we may justifiably claim that ethics has deteriorated in sports. Just as sport takes on a different look when we are aware of its history and culture, the social and ethical conflicts within sports and society take on a different appearance when we consider sports management decisions in light of the ethical perspectives developed in philosophy over the last 2,500 years. Let's consider some of the theoretical ethical perspectives which were discussed at the Summit on Sports.
One of the really interesting things that we can do in and through the study of sport, I think, is to introduce our students to some of the philosophical grades. Because very often their discussions about sport and sports values often mirror, often in a diminished fashion, what great thinkers have thought about life generally.
You look at the kinds of virtues that Aristotle encouraged us to have, and many of them are the virtues that precisely you need in a world of sport. I mean, think, for example, the virtue of courage. And Aristotle's real clear about this. He said, well, the courage requires, among other things, good judgment. It's not foolhardiness, and think about the sports where people take chances that are unnecessary chances for minimal gains, and that's the kind of thing Aristotle said, that's not a virtue, that's just foolishness. And so but the virtue is the ability to face one's, in this case, in courage, the ability to face one's fears and overcome them. And some of the most impressive things in sports, I remember when I first discovered that there were a number of mountain climbers who had fears of heights. And I thought, gee, I could relate to the fear of height, if not the mountain climbing. But in fact, one of the things that was impressive about that is that they took their worst fear and confronted it head on. And that's the type of thing that we find in sports continually, is the development of virtues such as courage, virtues such as perseverance. One of the things Aristotle always said is that virtue is a habit. It's not something, you can't have virtue on Tuesday morning. Virtue is something that you do for a lifetime. And you see that in dedicated athletes. You see that the way in which their discipline is a habit, something that they do every day of their lives. And also, one of the things that Aristotle realized is that you do these things ultimately because what draws you is your love of them, your attraction for them, and you see that in great athletes. You see that they love the game, and that they may also love many of the things around the game, but there's an element of just pure. They do that in that moment because that's the one thing they want to do, is play that game, and that's characteristic also of play in general, is that what makes it distinctive is we do it for its own sake. And the difference between play and work is often understood as the difference between what we do for its own sake or what we do for the sake of something else, usually a paycheck, and that's why play, and in many ways sports, are their own reward, because it's the doing of it that's the reward.
Well, what kind of rules are there in sport, and how do these relate to the rules in moral life? And the great rule theorist, if you like, is of course Kant. And people like Warren Fraley have taken on a Kantian framework and tried to set up the duties of the good sports player and the duties of the good sports coach. And of course we might think, well, if sports players have duties to keep the rule and duties toward other persons, to respect them as persons, of course there are going to be certain kinds of rights. So we might kind of say to ourselves, well, what rights adhere in this situation? I'm very interested in children's rights. Now, if we look at children in sport, think about the hours they now spend. In any other sphere, this might look like exploitative labor. Because, of course, sport is fun to begin with, but if you're an 8-year-old practicing 3 and 4 hours a day, and then maybe you're in a pool, maybe you're a swimmer, maybe you're watching those tiles, or lap after lap after lap. Or if you're a runner, you're out. No, as young kids, well, this is hard work, labor even. Should we be worried about this? Okay, let's think in terms of this. Well, if we're worried about that, what kind of rights attach here? What would you think of children as a special category for whom moral rights adhere? And if there are rights, what kind of duties adhere to those rights? Or, as I'm most interested in, we might think of a virtue vocabulary and how sports might relate to that. And we see Aristotle as the great virtue theorist. And so, for instance, in Aristotle's time, we think of the warrior, the citizen soldier, there to stand at the gates and preserve the city's integrity as the paragon of moral virtue. And there are tremendous resonances, I think, certainly in elite male sports, still about this warrior mentality, and there seems to be a strong connection here. So if we were to ask ourselves questions about courage in sports, for instance, if we saw Walter Payton diving over a mass of football players head first and toppling all the way over. Now, this is a tremendously impressive piece of behavior in one sense. You know, what was his goal? To achieve that touchdown in this crucial game. And he exhibited a certain kind of virtue. But was it a virtue? Well, it looks like courage, doesn't it? But when does courage become recklessness? So we might ask with Aristotle, is a virtue some kind of mean, some kind of middle ground between recklessness or timidity, cowardice? Now, was this reckless or was it courageous? So we might investigate now the nature of a virtue through looking at everyday actions in sport. Although this is a spectacular one, we must ask ourselves about, does this piece of behaviour really exemplify a virtue? Or is it the vice of excess, rashness, recklessness? He could have killed himself. He has a family to keep. He has children he loves. It clearly wasn't timidity. You wouldn't find too many timid players on the football pitch. But then we must also ask about the nature of the goal he was trying to achieve. Is this a worthy goal? Should he really set his whole life in the service of this end?
Sports, as other aspects of society, may be characterized in Aristotle's ethical theory as a virtue-laden or virtue-lacking activity. Yet there are many decisions in sports management that may be best seen as decisions employing the utilitarian ethical principle of seeking the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In utilitarian decisions, an option is chosen when the total happiness, pleasure, or utility resulting from that choice exceeds that of any other available option. The rule-based ethics of Kant and others stress the proper selection and application of rules and the establishment of duties for all participants and in all activities. It became clear at the summit that every sports situation can be described using the language of virtues and the values which they embody. It also became clear that we could apply the language and ethical theory of utilitarianism and attempt to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And it was clear that we could apply the language and ethical theories of rules and responsibilities to the same situation. The important insight from this experience is this. When we use each of these three ethical theories to frame a sports management or societal situation, we are apt to capture more of the ethical aspects of the situation than if we were to limit our consideration to a single ethical viewpoint. When our management problem is framed in a more inclusive way, with greater sensitivity to the ethics of the situation, we are better prepared to manage ethically and make a superior decision. Sports has come a long way in America. From the itinerant college athletes of the 1920s, the deaths on the football playing fields, and the fixed championship games, to complex systems of values and rules intended to maximize utility. But we can ask, whose happiness is being maximized? Who gets to set the rules? Are things getting better? And if they are getting better, for whom? Putting sports in historical and ethical context creates a larger framework which may help us make better decisions and apply the best criteria to evaluate the outcomes of our actions. If sport in the past was more unethical than we previously thought, then perhaps obtaining a sense of history and an unethical perspective will help us create a more ethical sports environment for the future. Have you faced similar ethical challenges? You are invited to participate with us at the Virtual Summit, where we continue our discussion on ethics in sport management at www.philosophylab.com.